So it sounds like Azov and a couple other Ukrainian units are stuffing the Russians north of Pokrovsk, which stuffing is just kind of a gentler way of saying hunting down and killing them one by one. Now, that's according to Bakhmut Demon, who put this information out last night, saying, quote, Azov and others are stuffing everyone, adding today, quote, the idiots dumped their suckers straight into the cauldron. Now, we've been talking about this infiltration of sorts north of Pokrovsk for a couple days now. The information space there is still incredibly vague, but we today have a little more information, both from the Ukrainian and the Russian side, to run through. We do know that Azov was deployed as a bit of a quick reaction force to this region to plug the gaps and then hunt down and eliminate these Russian infiltrators. Azov put out a report last night saying, quote, in their area of responsibility, 151 occupiers have been eliminated, more than 70 Russians have been wounded, and during this period, 8 Russian servicemen have been taken prisoner. Now, I do want to stress that as of this recording, we don't have any visual confirmation of any of that except for the POWs. We did get some footage of Russian POWs taken in this area. Turning over to the map here real quick to give you an idea of the area we're talking about. Here we have deep state map, sticking with the satellite view for those interested. We might go back to the normal one at some point. Got a lot of positive feedback on actually being able to see some of the roads and the fields and the tree lines, things like that. Nonetheless, this little rabbit ear piece pushing north of Pokrovsk, to give you an idea of how much this has changed in recent days, just going back to the beginning of the month, you can see that this area was entirely under Ukrainian control. Over the course of, we saw a pretty big movement in terms of map control this past Friday, August 9th, and then on Monday into Tuesday and Wednesday, a significant jump north by Russian forces. Now, I just wrapped up an interview with some of the guys in the Azov International Battalion. I hope to have live here before too long. The interview is because we have a fundraiser for those guys right now, picking up night vision devices, thermals, comms equipment, and drones. That'll, of course, be linked in the description below. But they weren't all that concerned, essentially saying these infiltrations actually happen a fair amount. Their view, if I'm kind of reading between the lines, is this was maybe there was more worry in the media than there was inside of the Ukrainian military. Again, personal assessment there. But looking at this breakthrough infiltration to the north, depending on what we're going to call it today, a couple of comments here from some analysts. Clement Moline over on X, an incredible analyst that I'll have linked below, said the arrival of reinforcements, including those from the 1st Azov Corps, made it possible to contain the Russian infiltration. It turned out to be more significant than expected, which contradicts the minimization by some, particularly due to the lack of visual evidence. And I want to stress, it's not just that Ukraine is not putting visual evidence out right now, neither is Russia, which is out of character. I mean, we just in recent days have videos of Russian forces doing flag planting operations, sometimes people skeptically call them, where Russian forces find their way behind Ukrainian lines, wave a flag for a drone, and they may or may not be eliminated shortly thereafter. It doesn't matter. It's a PR win. We're not even getting that from the Russian forces up in this area, so it is pretty much an entire media blackout. But Moline says, quote, thus around 200 Russians killed and wounded. That's a lot for an infiltration, which confirms a certain accumulation of infantry. Now begins the most difficult work for the Ukrainian forces, counterattacking against their own fortifications. And this is something we talked about. The challenge here is Ukraine has been all along the front for months, if not years, now developing significant defensive positions for them to fall back to. All right, so we've seen the challenge before in areas of the front. Avdiivka is a good example where the defensive positions behind that were not stable enough. So when Avdiivka fell, Russians actually were able to advance pretty quickly. So what we've seen along the front is Ukraine taking the time, energy, and resources to build up significant trench lines, anti-tank obstacles, barbed wire, fields of fire, all that stuff. In this area north of Pokrovsk, the Russians moved so quickly in small groups, 1 to 4 at a time at most, that they snuck through the lines and have now started to occupy in small numbers Ukrainian fortified positions just facing the other way. So it's not as though when we get into some of these areas here, maybe this tree line, just to use it as an example, it's not as though there's just 4 Russians in here hiding behind trees. They very well might be in a pretty significant Ukrainian dugout that was set to be utilized when Ukrainian forces had to fall back. That could lead to some pretty nasty fighting in this area before too long, which generally seems to be the same assessment for both Russian and Ukrainian sides. Moline continued by saying, "Beware of the many lies being spread. First, the Ukrainian army is not on the verge of collapse, and it is impossible for the breakthrough to be exploited in depth quickly, as some have implied. It is even possible that the Ukrainians managed to temporarily push back the threat. Right now, we're seeing, again, according to Russian sources, the resupply for these elements is being done via drones. Like they're flying one-way drones, crashing them near the position, and then the soldiers get water, ammunition, whatever they might need to stay alive for a couple more days. That is not something that you can sustain a large-scale offensive on. So if Russia wants to exploit this opportunity, they have a relatively narrow strip of land that they would need to move through to be able to push up vehicles, even unarmored vehicles like ATVs, motorcycles, scooters, pickup trucks, things like that. Armored vehicles start moving through here, it's going to get a lot of attention, the attention of a lot of drone units in the area. Moline continues by saying the situation is more serious than some would like to believe. The Russian tactic is quite interesting in this regard. They send hundreds of soldiers for dozens of days behind the lines. Then they carry out ambushes before reinforcements allow control of the area, which is what happened in Dobropilya. Over here, again, remember 2 days ago, we started to get information that there might actually be Russian forces in and around this town, which were some right away. It was a shocking speed at which that happened, where it went from the front lines were all the way back here near Radinsky to, wait a minute, no, they're 20 kilometers north and maybe even in this next safe town behind the lines in Dobropilya. A lot more information on that, this infiltration type tactic, how to push back against it and how Russia is utilizing it, is the focus of one of the interviews that we just wrapped up with the guys in Azov. Again, hope to have that published here shortly. Now, I do want to turn over to the Russian assessment of how things look north of Pokrovsk, but before diving into that, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. So this is always fun, and I'm sure many of you can relate. Just yesterday, I got this email from Groupon. Remember them? Anyways, they were letting me know that there had been a data breach that included my personal information, which is super. Now, to be fair to Groupon, it wasn't a breach of their systems, but the best part here is that I don't think I've used that site but like one time back in 2015 to book a trip. Doesn't matter, because now that information is sure to end up with data brokers who will happily sell it to anyone, no questions asked. Now, based on breaches like this, data brokers are able to piece together information on people to identify their age, address, family status, medical condition, even religious and political affiliation. And I don't think anybody really wants their personal information out there like that for sale. And this is where tools like Delete Me come in, the sponsor of today's video. Delete Me is a subscription service that constantly scans the internet, and when they find your personal data available for sale, they have it removed. Now, I personally use Delete Me, and here's a look at my most recent report where they reviewed 3,935 listings, found and removed 11 listings with 11 different data brokers that contained 120 pieces of my personally identifiable information. And look at last month, only 2 listings removed. And that's why the subscription aspect here is so important. This is the kind of thing that isn't one and done. You've got to stay on top of it. Or, like I prefer, have Delete Me stay on top of it for you. So if you want to protect yourself and your family from these data brokers, get started with Delete Me today. You can scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the pinned comment and description below. And be sure to use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. And thank you so much to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. All right, in terms of the Russian view of things, again, across the board, all Russian channels, those that are overly optimistic to those that are pessimistic, have generally been saying, we just don't know what's happening right now. Military Informant, which tends to be a rather reliable source, said, quote, by the end of the second day since the event began, there are still no adequate visual confirmations from the area about how deep the Russian assault groups managed to advance and where exactly they managed to establish themselves. According to the most optimistic views, the infiltrated assault troops managed to hold on to the outskirts of Kucherov Yar. This is interesting. We'll come back here in a second. Which the enemy claimed to have reached on the first day. According to much more conservative estimates, the Russian armed forces have a stable foothold on Nikanorovka. Zoom out a little bit here to give you an idea of where that is, all the way down here on the south, and on the outskirts of Rodinsky. And that elongated gut forward is nothing more than limited actions of sabotage and reconnaissance groups. So again, this is a Russian source at this point saying the furthest that he thinks anyone might be is this area here. So even Ukrainian maps have Russian forces not just expanding the gray zone, contested area, quite a bit north of that, but also saying that this is actually held by Russian forces now. And something to keep in mind when looking at these red areas on the map that signify Russian control, throughout this conflict, it's always been very challenging to say, well, do they actually control that or not? And this is a great example right here. If you have 3 Russian soldiers in this area, would you say that Russia controls that? I don't know. To me, that's probably what they're getting at, is this is probably a lot more of a gray zone up north than necessarily red and controlled by Russia. I do find it interesting that the Russian assessment as well, their pessimistic view, is all the way back down here near Novoshakhov, which means that this entire push, if we pull the ruler out, see if I can actually click the right one, there's a 10-kilometer difference. That's how much is unknown right now, even on the Russian side. And they're saying optimistic up here in the north, not even up here in the north, pessimistic all the way down here in the south. That's how wide-ranging assessments are right now. They say the enemy continues to mark the outskirts of Zolote Kolodez, right here, and neighboring Vasil is controlled by the Russian army. Meanwhile, the panic rhetoric of Ukrainian commanders from the first days has already shifted to statements about stopping the breakthrough and deploying additional reserves to stabilize the situation. So far, it is reliably known that the possible breakthrough zones, the First Corps of the National Guard Azov, is counterattacking Russian positions sent there specifically to rectify the situation. However, no full-fledged visual materials from the enemy are being published either. So, again, a lot of unknown in every direction. The only thing we really know at this point is that Azov, the First Corps, has been deployed to this region as a QRF to not just stop the lines and move into areas that may be gaps in Ukrainian positions, but also move into some of these gray zones here to identify these groups of 1, 2, 3, 4 Russian soldiers that are maybe hiding in basements, in tree lines, or pre-built Ukrainian trenches. Identify them, hunt them down, eliminate them, or take them prisoner. We have one more Russian assessment here. This is coming from the reports of the Zov militia, another mill blogger, where they say undoubtedly the hottest area right now is the northern face of the encirclement, talking about the northern portion of Pokrovsk. They say part of Zolote Kolodets is essentially in a gray zone. So their assessment is this is a gray zone up north, but the heights are under our control. Meanwhile, the command has had to redirect units of the 51st Army to the northwest to help the 8th Army pull up. And he talks about that happening in the Shakov area down here to the southeast, and thereby secure its right flank. This will immediately strengthen our position and render the enemy's counterattack pointless. Thus, the main battles here in the coming days will be very tough, meaning and sticky. So maybe some Russian reinforcements coming up here. We have seen in recent weeks just the challenges of moving anything near the front lines with the volume of drones that Ukraine has. So what we're seeing in a lot of this breakthrough or infiltration are individual soldiers able to kind of slip under the radar. Very hard to do that in mass. So we've got some videos. I'll play some here showing just the level of destruction and how many vehicles are destroyed when trying to move up to a forward position in areas that are 5, 10, sometimes even 15 kilometers behind the line of contact. Now, I do want to shift over to the other big topic that's on everyone's mind right now around this conflict. We've got ceasefire negotiations or talks or whatever we want to call it happening in Alaska tomorrow. Now, the U.S. position generally has not changed much in recent days. A big part of this, personal opinion, is that Trump is kind of a wild card, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing tends to depend on the day. And I think that's probably worth keeping in mind going in. But we've got a few different looks here from the United States perspective and from the Russian perspective on what we might expect out of tomorrow's talks. Starting here with Condoleezza Rice, a former U.S. Secretary of State, talking about Putin's mindset going in, and she's a little more optimistic, saying, look, there might actually be an opening here. This might be the time that we, the United States, could pressure Putin to actually bring about some sort of end to this conflict. Here we go.
I think he just has a hard time accepting that he can't crush Ukraine. A country that he doesn't actually believe is a country. He told us it was a made-up country. But now, with the threats against the Russian economy, with the shot across the bow about secondary sanctions, maybe it's starting to occur to him that he needs to stop this war. But he's certainly trying to deflect any action that the president might take. And so maybe he hopes that going into the room, he can once again use words to convince the president that he still wants peace. But I would just hope that the president remembers what he said very eloquently that he got off the phone with Putin and they bombed Ukraine that night. That's the true Vladimir Putin.
So, there's a lot of kind of mixed feelings going into this. There are people in the United States that think that this is the biggest step taken yet throughout this conflict, and Trump has a real chance of bringing about an actual end to the war. And there's others that are far more pessimistic. To be honest, I feel myself a little more in the pessimistic category here. And the next couple of pieces, I think, will play into that. I just don't know what exactly is going to come out of this. And as mentioned previously, I feel like Trump is a bit of a wild card, and there might not actually be a real strategy at play here, and he's going entirely off his gut. That doesn't make me super comfortable when we're talking about major geopolitical issues like this. That's something that Ambassador Michael Fall got into in this next clip. Fall is the former ambassador to Russia, and what he really harps on here is there's no coherent strategy from the United States right now in dealing with Putin or Russia. Here we go.
But when you look at the actual policies, not what he says, but what he does, I just don't think he has a strategy to achieve that objective. So with respect to sanctions, he said a lot of tough things. He said we're going to impose secondary sanctions on India and China. And first he said that would be at 100%. And then he backed away from that to say left out China. And then he said just India. But then he reduced it to 25%. But then he gave himself 3 more weeks before implementing it. And that just is a metaphor for what I think has been a rather ineffective negotiating strategy. And more broadly speaking, I would say that his general strategy has been to appease Putin, to give him concessions, and to pressure President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And that strategy has not yielded results. I would say just the opposite. It has emboldened Putin to keep asking for more, so much so that you now have this absurd position that Putin is asking for Ukraine to withdraw from territory that it still holds.
And we talked in yesterday's video about the most recent list of demands, I guess is the best way to put it, as laid out by Russia and Ukraine. Big picture, Russia is still saying we want eastern Ukraine, and there will be no Ukraine joining NATO, and there will be a cap on the Ukrainian military, both in terms of the size of the force and their capabilities, and they want international recognition of their annexed territories, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. The Ukrainian list of demands was much more it was much less, all things considered. They said we need a viable ceasefire, an actual ceasefire in place before we talk about any sort of territorial concessions. They wanted the return of POWs and the abducted Ukrainian children that are currently scattered all across Russia. They wanted Russia to provide reimbursement for the damages done inside of Ukraine. And then they wanted no cap on their military or their ability to provide some sort or secure some sort of security guarantee from the United States, other partners in Europe, or whatever it might be. Now, turning to some Russian assessments here, military foreman again said, quote, "No one should expect Russia to agree to a ceasefire along the entire front, even under the threat of sanctions, nor should anyone expect Ukraine to voluntarily give up even part of its territory." And that's kind of the sticking point here. As we get into the talks tomorrow, both sides have kind of drawn a hard line, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of wiggle room in either direction. He says, in our view, to maintain Trump's involvement in the negotiation process without additional pressure on Russia, the Russian delegation may offer the American president the so-called air ceasefire over Ukraine. And we've seen this mentioned a couple times in Russian media, kind of floating it out there, maybe trying to get an idea of how supportive or receptive the population or Putin supporters might be. They say by air ceasefire, here is meant mutual cessation of missile and drone strikes at greater depths on each other's targets. Such raids cause serious damage both to Ukrainian industry and to the Russian fuel and energy complex, so a possible agreement will serve not only a political purpose, but also a quite utilitarian one. Maybe. I understand where that could come in. I think that would be very hard to implement long term. Again, you're talking about two warring nations. If the conflict is still hot at the front, where do you draw that line and say, are you only allowed to carry out strikes 20 kilometers behind the front, 50 kilometers behind the front? Where is that? And it just, at some point, you're going after the enemy's ability to supply and continue to fight the war. That's why Ukraine is going after Russian factories, why Ukraine is going after Russian rail facilities, why they're going after, and where is that front line drawn? right? My guess is Russia would probably draw it at the line of contact. Would they somehow find a way to make all of Ukraine inaccessible by Ukrainian, or all of Crimea inaccessible by Ukrainian munitions? That doesn't seem feasible. At the same time, Ukraine is churning out more and more of their homegrown munitions to stay and continue fighting this war. Russia's been targeting those day in and day out. I find it hard to believe that Russia would kind of let that sit and allow Ukraine to continue to fulfill the demand of drones at the front and just not strike targets across Ukraine. But either way, another assessment here from Alexander Kotz. He says, let's be without illusions. This war will not end on Friday. We should not indulge in inflated expectations, and most likely there will be no ceasefire. There can be no breakthrough decisions on Ukraine at such a meeting that would instantly end the war. They simply do not exist in nature. Maybe if President Zelensky was there, there might be a possibility, but I think the safe assessment here is no major decisions can be made on Friday because one of the two warring parties isn't there. And that kind of puts a stop in exactly how far this can go. I'm hesitant to make any assumptions as to what the information is that comes out of this meeting between Putin and Trump tomorrow. I feel like it could change on a dime and go in a lot of different directions. So we'll wait and see what happens tomorrow. We'll do our best to cover it from a couple different directions, as well as the assessments and the follow-up and the analysis from the Ukrainian perspective, the Russian perspective, the U.S., both left and right of the political spectrum, as best as possible, to where hopefully, optimistic side of me coming out, hopefully there's some progress tomorrow, actually moving towards a viable and just peace to end this war. But that's all we got for now. Again, if interested in contributing to the current fundraiser, we've got that linked in the description below. Awesome cause, running through Zynga's paw. We're already at like 25% of the goal in 2 days, which is insane because all of you are incredibly generous. I'm always humbled by how quickly these fundraisers go. It's just so cool to see. But if interested, if able, and wanting to contribute, that will be linked below. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.